Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over the next fallacy of the chapter, and I call it empirical evidence fallacy, right? So in this video, we're now going to address the main core of atheist arguments, right? So in the last video, we looked at a piece of that core. I don't think it's like the main reason people are atheists, but I think it does come up commonly enough in atheist arguments that it was worth addressing. So we talked about evil deity fallacy, and that addressed the problem of suffering and evil in the world and God sending people to hell and things like that. So just to recap, for that fallacy, the atheists will basically say that because of the problem of suffering and evil, they can't see how God could be all-loving, which is a property usually attributed to him. They can't see how he can be all-loving with those things existing. Now, what they're doing, which is what they do a lot of the time, they're going by their own random made-up opinion of what goodness is. We have to accept that if God exists, right, he knows more than us about the nature of morality and the nature of reality, so we would appeal to his definition. And from his perspective, which is the absolute perspective, the true perspective, it's perfectly possible that the moral thing to do is to allow suffering, the moral thing to do is to allow evil, and the moral thing to do is to send people to hell for all eternity. They just don't like it because they're on the receiving end of that justice, right, of that morality. So they want morality to just change to whatever makes them feel better, right? And so in other words, that's a coping mechanism. So it's a fallacy to say that God is not loving if these things exist. So that was basically last chapter, last video, but like I said, I don't think that's at the core of why people are atheists. So what is at the core of it is really this point, so I'm going to go over it. It says the most common argument against the existence of God is lack of evidence, right? So that is what you will always hear an atheist say. There is no evidence for the existence of God, and that's why they're atheists, right? Because they haven't seen anything they can say is evidence for God's existence. Now, what I want to show is that I'm unable to show that this claim is false, right? So I can't say for sure that, well, I kind of can, but for the moment, I'll just say I can't show that there does exist evidence of God. However, what I do want to say is that this claim is extremely erroneous, right? It contains a logical fallacy, which is this fallacy here, so I'm going to explain it throughout the video. But it contains a fallacy, and that's why it doesn't make any sense. Now, atheist beliefs in general, pretty much all of them, or all atheist arguments, in one way or another, are predicated on this core belief, this core assertion. So what I actually want to do, I'm going to do some of it in this video, but really over the next couple videos. So I think 3 videos, including this one in total. I'm going to show that the entire sort of belief system of atheists, or really the core of their arguments, because their arguments are generally sort of like, different arguments branch out from a basic core argument or a core set of arguments. There might be different ones here and there, more unique and more specific, but generally those arguments are based on a core set of arguments, and those core set of arguments are generally predicated on this core assertion. So what I want to show is that all those beliefs, or that core set of beliefs, are full of holes and fallacies, and they make no sense, right? So that's what I want to establish beginning with this video, but I'm going to do it throughout the next couple videos. Now, what I want to say is that there is a problem with knowing God, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this video, and I'm going to talk about what the solution to that problem is, I think in the last video of the chapter. Now, because of that problem, atheists will generally look at that problem and then come to this conclusion. I want to establish that this conclusion is faulty, and I want to give you the correct conclusion and the correct way to solve the problem at the end of the chapter. So basically, just wanted to say that that's basically what I want to do, right? That's basically my goal throughout these next couple videos. So to get into it, actually, before I go to that point, generally when you're talking to an atheist, right, especially when they're talking to someone who believes in God, which they call theist, which to me, that's always like a strange sort of term. I just think of it as a normal person, a normal, rational person, right? But anyway, right? But I know why they use the term. So they'll say that if they're talking to someone who believes in God, they will say, even if they're hard atheists, let's just say for the moment, they'll say they have no beliefs about God, and they're not making any claims about God. They will say that the person who does, if someone says they do believe in God, or that God does exist, more specifically, if they say God exists, the atheist will say, no problem, what is your evidence? Just present evidence to me, and if you could present evidence to me that proves God's existence, then I'll believe, right? So that's usually how they'll approach it. But I want to demonstrate that there's a fallacy right there. So right in that statement where they say, present evidence to me of God and I'll believe, right? In that is a fallacy, right? Already, right? And atheists don't usually realize there's a fallacy in that way of thinking. And when I'm debating them, I always point it out to them, right? So to establish what that fallacy is, which is basically what I'm going to do throughout the video, but I want to go to this point, which says that atheists are unable to prove that God doesn't exist, right? So normally they'll say, if you present them with a piece of evidence, they'll say, well, the person who believes in God might say that this proves God's existence. And the atheist will say, no, it doesn't. And then you can also argue back to them, even if you make the claim this doesn't prove even if you make the claim this doesn't prove God's existence, you can't say it doesn't prove his existence. Now, what will the atheist say to that, right? They will usually say, well, you can't, the burden of proof isn't on me because you can't prove a negative, which that's actually true. You can't prove a negative. You can't prove something isn't true or something doesn't exist. You can only sort of establish a reasonable logical conclusion on why something does exist. Or just to shorten it, you can establish proof that something does exist, or you can only prove a positive claim. You can't prove a negative claim. And that is true. However, the reason I mention this here is because there's another fallacy that's incorporated into this. It's not the reason the atheist isn't able to prove that God doesn't exist isn't just because you can't prove a negative. Now, I know that should be enough, right? But there's actually another reason he can't do it even after that. Let's assume you could prove that. You could prove a negative. There's another fallacy that prevents the atheist to do that, even if you could do that. And that's what I want to get at in this video. Now, in order to set that up for why that applies to God, I want to first establish kind of an epistemological framework that I'm working from. So that's what I'm actually going to be doing a lot throughout these videos, setting up more of what you might call the epistemology. So, if you're not familiar, epistemology is just a term in philosophy. Well, it's actually a branch of philosophy, which is basically just the study of knowledge. It's the study of different aspects of knowledge. Like, what does it mean to know something? What are the properties of things that can be known? And things like that, right? I use the term a little bit differently. I think of epistemology more as a set of directions, almost like an algorithm or a program, right? A set of directions and definitions for what it means to know something and how we're to go about knowing it, which is similar to science, right? Or scientific method. That's how I approach it. So I'm going to talk a little more about it from the perspective of science in the next video and the video after that. But first, I want to set up an epistemological framework here first, just in a more general way, and then I'm going to relate it back to God in this next point. So I remember I was on Reddit, right? And I was in this atheist thread. So like I said, I debate a lot of atheists on Reddit. And there was this thread where this guy was asking atheists why they believe what they believe. Like, why do you believe that there's no God, right? He was saying you guys must believe something beyond the physical, or at least find it reasonable to believe that there exists something beyond the physical, right? Why do you guys really just believe that there's no God, right? And one of the guys said that he believes that you have to have justification for why you believe something. And he was saying, let me put it like this. If I told you that I was a wizard, right, and I had magic powers, he was asking, would you believe that, right? Now, you can't prove I'm not a wizard. You can't prove I have no powers, right? But if I said that, would you believe that I have that, right? Just because you can't prove it. And he was like, the guy didn't answer. The guy didn't answer in his thread, but basically in his post he was saying, no, right? You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you that, even if you couldn't scientifically prove that I don't have magical powers. And basically what he was saying was, that's basically how it is with God, right? And so then I told him that's not really true. I told him that's not a proper analogy for God, because for one particular reason. And this is something atheists always do, right? I didn't even read this yet, I forgot. So let me read this. So it says, to make a claim about observable evidence for the existence of a thing, you need it to be sufficiently well-defined enough to have a necessary condition, right? So very important. So now I know that sounds like kind of a mouthful, so I'm actually going to break that down. There's two components to it. So there's the first component is the well-defined component, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, what I'm saying there, and to be clear, I think I mentioned before, I haven't really studied epistemology that much, so I'm assuming these claims to be true. If they are, I'm sure they're somewhere in epistemology, right? But this is just my wording for these ideas. So in order to make a claim that something is true, right, or there's evidence for a thing, or even to make an inference about the possible existence of the evidence for a thing, that thing itself has to be well-defined, or has to be sufficiently well-defined to do that, right? Or the definition has to be strong enough or complete enough, right? You can't say that there's evidence for or against something if the definition itself is not complete enough, right? So, for example, if I were to tell you that a hubba, right? If I were to tell you that exists, or if I were to if I were to ask you, does that exist? Does a hubba exist? You couldn't tell me, right? Because you don't know what that is, right? In other words, and that's an extreme example, but in other words, the definition of what that is not complete. It's incomplete. You know what it sounds like, you know what I'm calling it, right? That doesn't tell you enough about what it is, right? You need to know more, right? If I tell you a hubba is a type of food, right? Well, now you got much more information, right? Now, I still need to give you more information, but now you have some sense of understanding on whether this thing might exist. If I say a hubba is a superhero with superpowers from Krypton, right? You may say, no, that doesn't exist, right? Now, can you prove that doesn't exist? No. But you can make an inference about it because you have enough understanding about what this thing is to make an inference about what evidence of it might look like, right? So if a hubba is actually a Kryptonian with superpowers, right, that's a very strong definition, right? You haven't observed people with superpowers who claim to be from Krypton, right? Is that proof that such a being doesn't exist? Well, no, right? They might still exist, presumably, right? But you're not going to believe that because you really have not seen any evidence of such a thing, right? So in other words, in order to make an inference about what evidence of a thing looks like, and then from there to make an inference about whether evidence of this thing possibly exists, your definition has to be complete enough to do that. You can't do it if it's not complete enough. And so the issue with the analogy that the Atheist Online was giving about God is in the God and the wizard is that he's saying that even if you can't prove a wizard doesn't exist with magic powers, right, you're likely not going to believe that. And he was basically saying that's how they think of God. They don't have any justifiable reason to believe God exists based on the observable evidence. And what I was telling him is no, right? The reason you could do that with the wizard is because the wizard is sufficiently well defined, right? A wizard, presumably, is a human, right? Presumably they're human, so I'm adding to the definition. I'm establishing what the definition of a wizard is. The components of that definition. They're a human, right? They're alive. They're made up of matter, right? They have the same properties. Because they're alive, I should mention, they have the same properties as everyone else who's alive, meaning their body's made up of cells. Those cells have metabolism. They take in energy from the environment. They obey the laws of physics, and so they're made up of atoms, or they're made up of the components of matter, right? So because I know all of this is given to me by the definition, I can now make inferences about what evidence of a wizard might look like. And based on that, what evidence possibly looks like, I can say, well, I haven't observed anything that tells me that type of evidence exists, so I can make an inference that this thing probably doesn't exist, a wizard. You can't do that with God because I argue God is not sufficiently well defined enough to do that. And that's the mistake atheists always make, right? They always will say, and they kind of contextualize it, in terms of this statement, right? In other words, they'll say, well, I can't prove that God doesn't exist, but, and they'll compare it to saying, oh, I can't prove fire-breathing dragons in space don't exist. Does that mean they exist? No. So just like you can't prove God doesn't exist, that doesn't mean it exists. And if you are willing to accept that, then you have to accept that any imaginary creature exists on the basis that you can't prove it. And they're trying to contextualize in this kind of simple, often lazy sort of analysis. No, right? Because the difference between these imaginary creatures you're just making up and God is that those things are well defined, right? If a fire-breathing dragon in space exists, right, if that's your claim, I can't prove it doesn't exist. However, if it's alive, if it's a life form, I can make an inference about its nature based on the observable nature of life forms, right? It must have, like I said before, it's made up of cells. Those cells can only really function properly in a particular environment. The environment has to be hospitable to life. Space is not hospitable to life at all, so probably they don't exist. Can I prove it? No. Can I make an inference about evidence, and based on that inference, make a conclusion that it probably doesn't exist? Yes, right? You can't do that with God. So it's a fallacy to compare the sort of framework of logic of believing that something doesn't exist. It's a fallacy to say that for something that's well-defined and compare it to something that's not well-defined. It doesn't apply, right? So I'm going to go into that a little bit more in this next point, but so that's the first part, right? So the second part of this is the necessary condition part. So basically, to get into it, most people have heard about this, but if you haven't, I'll just kind of explain it really quickly. So you often hear about these terms, necessary and sufficient conditions, right? So what does that mean? Well, just to go over it really quickly, if something is a necessary condition, that just means that if that condition is true, then there's some statement that is automatically true also, right? So as an example, let's say that I say I'm in the state of New York, right? So I'm in New York. Then a necessary condition for that statement to be true is that I must be in one of the counties or towns in New York, right? Because all of the space of New York, right, is filled up by towns and counties. So I can't possibly be in New York without also being in one of the towns and counties in New York, right? So a necessary condition for me to be in New York is that I must be in one of the towns and counties. That statement I'm in New York can't possibly be true unless that other statement's true. Now, sufficient condition is a condition that contains the necessary condition, but also contains an extraneous condition. That extraneous condition sort of limits it more. But what it does is it says that if the sufficient condition is true, then it's also true that the statement is true. But the statement could be true without that sufficient condition being true because it contains that little extra sort of rule to it. If the statement's true, then the necessary condition has to be true by definition. But if the statement's true, then the sufficient condition need not be true because it has that extra thing to it. So, as an example, let's say that a person says, I'm in New York, right? A necessary condition is that I must be in one of the towns and counties in New York. But a sufficient condition for that statement to be true is that I'm in Queens, right? So in other words, if I'm in Queens, I have to be in New York by definition, right? But it's perfectly possible for me to be in New York but not be in Queens, right? So the sufficient condition, if the sufficient condition is true, then the statement that I'm in New York is true. So like I said, very quickly, if you're already familiar with that stuff, then that was completely unnecessary, right? But some people may not be familiar with that concept of a necessary sufficient condition. So why is that important here? Well, I make the claim, so like I said, I'm sure this exists somewhere in epistemology, I don't know what they call it, but I'm going to make the claim that you cannot say that if you say something doesn't exist or there's no evidence for a thing, what that means, what you're really saying is you haven't observed anything that contains the necessary condition. So very important. In other words, I make the claim that you cannot say something doesn't exist or there's no evidence for a thing if you haven't observed the sufficient condition. It has to be the case that you can only make that claim if you haven't observed the necessary condition. So sometimes I call that sufficiency fallacy. Again, I don't know what it's really called, but that's what I call it. So as an example, let's say that you're looking for a particular person, right? And I make the claim that this person is in the state of New York, right? So let's say you want to verify if my claim is true, right? So you're looking for a person and you want to verify if the claim that they're in New York is true. Well, how might you go about doing that? Well, the first thing you would need to understand, the first thing you need to recognize is what is a necessary condition for my claim to be true, right? You want to find evidence of some kind that establishes that statement is true. What you're really saying is you're looking for evidence that meets the necessary condition, right? So, there's many necessary conditions we could come up with, but for the moment, I'll just have one. So I'll say that the necessary condition for my claim to be true is that this person must be in one of the towns or counties in New York, right? Because you can't, as we just said, you can't be in the state of New York and not be in one of its towns or counties. If you're in one of its towns or counties, then you're in the state of New York, right? So that's the necessary condition. So what you want to do is find evidence that establishes the truth of that necessary condition. So let's say, as an example, let's say that you start counting all the people in Queens, right? So you count every single head in Queens, and you don't find anyone that meets the description or the identity of this person you're looking for. Could you then conclude that my statement that this person is in New York is false? Well, no, right? That wouldn't make any sense, right? It's perfectly possible for this person to be in one of the other counties or towns in New York outside of Queens, right? In order to verify before you could say my claim is false, or even to say that you haven't seen evidence that my claim is true, you would have to count every single head in New York, all right? So you have to count all of them in every county. Because I said they're in the state of New York, right? So you have to count all the counties in New York. Only then could you make the claim that you didn't find anything that met the necessary condition for my statement to be true. Now, if you find a person in Queens County that meets my condition, if you find this person in Queens County, then yes, you can assume my statement is true because you found this person in Queens County, and Queens County is one of the counties or towns in New York, right? So you found evidence that met the necessary condition. But here's the issue. Why couldn't you count all the people in Queens, not see this person, and then conclude my statement is false? Because them being in Queens is only a sufficient condition. If you find them in Queens, great, you conclude my statement's true. But if you don't find them in Queens, you can't then say my statement's false, right? Because my statement didn't say they were in Queens, it was broader, it said they were in the state of New York. So you have to count all the people in New York before you can reasonably conclude there's no evidence that my claim is true, or even to say my claim is false, right? So, like I said, sometimes called that sufficiency fallacy. It would be a mistake to say that you saw all the people in Queens, but you didn't find this person, therefore my claim is false. No, right? That would only be true if I said they were in Queens. So why is any of that important? How does that relate to God? Well, to go over this, I'll go over this next point. It says, so atheists often don't recognize that their definition of God is not sufficiently well defined enough to have a necessary condition for evidence, right? So this is actually really important, right? So this is something that I've recognized is a mistake that atheists will often make, right? And so this is something that I learned when I was debating them and talking to them, right? And I see all of their debunks about God and this and that and how there's no evidence of God. Very often, now it's not always the case, there are atheists who don't make this mistake, who recognize that they're not allowed to do this logically, but there are many of them who do not. So what do I mean by this? Basically, what atheists will often do, right, let me actually back up for a moment. So before I said, in order to make a claim about evidence for a thing, right, in order to say that there's evidence for something or not evidence for a thing, that thing has to be sufficiently well defined, right? You can't make any claim about evidence unless the definition is complete enough, right? So I talked about that earlier. Now, what atheists do is they kind of go in the reverse, right? They make the definition, in a sense, too complete. And what I mean by that is they add a whole bunch of definitions and parameters and properties onto God, and then based on that definition, then they make the claim that there's no evidence of God and they haven't seen evidence and things like that. And when I'm talking to them, first of all, they do that basically with religion. So whenever you ask an atheist why they don't believe God exists, or why they would say there's no evidence of God, almost always, right, they go to religion, and what they're really saying is there's no evidence of God based on how they perceive God exists or defines him, and they often define him according to what some religion says he is. And I always tell them, like, it's perfectly possible, right, for God to exist without being what some holy book defines him to be, right? So usually they use Christianity, usually they use the Bible. So they'll say, oh, if God exists, then the Bible says that all this should happen and there should be all these miracles, and God used to talk to all these people, how come he's not doing it now? So in other words, because God doesn't have the behavior which they've ascribed to him based on how they've interpreted the Bible, right? Based on that, which does constitute their definition of God, they're saying there's no evidence of God. But like I said, it is perfectly possible for God to exist without any holy book in the world being correct, or without your interpretation of any one of the holy books being correct. And very often they don't recognize that. It seems like a very simple sort of analysis. I understood that when I was a kid, right? But if you ask them, right, and don't take my word for it, if you see a lot of the arguments that atheists will make, like I said, not all of them. So many of them are actually aware of that, but a lot of them aren't, right? When you talk about evidence of God, very often the first thing they go to is religion, right? And they'll say that, oh, why is there well, we talked about evil deity fallacy last chapter, but they'll talk about suffering. Why did God do this in the Bible? And why did he hurt people? And why is he so egotistical and an egomaniac and this and that? And it's like, yeah, but you can't make a claim that God doesn't exist just because the God which you've interpreted based on the Bible doesn't exist, right? Or you believe that God doesn't exist, right? It's perfectly possible, as I said, for God to exist without any of them being true. And so when I'm talking to them, right, I basically, now I'm already aware of that fact, I'm aware of this fallacy, which I'll complete it in a moment, but I'll just keep asking them questions more and more, right, until they eventually realize. Basically what ends up happening is when I tell them that none of that, God can exist without any of that stuff being true, that you're ascribing to him based on some holy book, right, what they end up doing is they recognize that that's true, and they end up sort of truncating their definition, or reducing their definition, because they often will have a definition of God which is not justified. Now, you can make any definition of God you want to, but you should at least have some justification on why you're ascribing this property to God, right? Why is your definition of God including these parameters, right? You should have some justification for it. And, all these other people follow this God of this religion and from this holy book, or they have an idea of God based on this holy book, is not a justifiable reason to have a definition of God, right? Like I said, it's perfectly possible for God to exist without those definitions being true. Everyone on the planet could be wrong and God can still exist, right? So that doesn't make any sense. And so they recognize that, they don't dispute that, and so they end up shrinking their definition more and more and more. And then something very interesting happens, right? So the definition becomes so shrunken, I don't know if I said that right, it becomes so small that eventually becomes not well defined, right? So, and that's what I always end up sort of bringing their attention to, right? Because I already know of that. I already know that's what's going to happen, right? Based on how they're arguing, I already know that they're engaging in these fallacies, which is empirical evidence fallacy. I'll get more to that in more of a complete sense in a moment. So I'll just keep asking them questions, and then they'll sort of shrink their definition of what God is, and then eventually they'll recognize that they don't really have a fully justified definition of God that allows them to make a claim about evidence. And I'm like, bingo, right? So that's what I already knew was the case. I just sort of probed and asked some questions to help them eventually see that. Because here's the thing. In order to, like I said, in order to say there's no evidence of God, right, you have to have a well-defined definition. And what is a proper or well-defined or even a justified definition of God that we can all agree upon, right? Because the religions of the earth is not a sufficient or justifiable definition, because they're all sort of practiced, you could say, by people. People are erroneous, right? We make mistakes. We live in error, right? We're not perfect. It's perfectly possible for every person on the planet to not have gotten it right regarding God, right? So what if you can't use religion, then what's a reasonable or rational definition to have about God, right? That you can say is justified. This has to be true in order for God to exist. Well, that's an interesting question, right? And different people have different sort of definitions on what that bare bone but justified definition is. Now, for me, when I'm debating them, I like to use this definition. So this is the one that I sort of believe in. So to go over this point, it says, God is any being with the property that they created the universe. So that's it, right? Very simple, right? If you are a person, or I should say, if there exists a being in all of existence, right? All of eternity, there just has to be just one that has this property, and this property could be ascribed to them and it's true, then we could say God exists. So if you created the universe, then you're God, right? So God exists. If your friend created the universe, then they're God. If you and your friend created the universe, then you're both God, right? So this is the only property you have to have in order to be God, right? You have to have the property that you created the universe. That's it, right? So I believe that's a justified definition, right? We don't really know how the universe came into being, and in many cases, right, this is cosmological argument, in many cases that's attributed to God, right? In most definitions of God in most religions, whether religious or even just spiritual and not really religious per se, right? Almost everyone agrees on this main property of God, right? There are many other properties that they ascribe to God, but pretty much everybody, right, has this core definition of God, right? Or this core property included in their definition. God is a being who created the universe. So let's define God as any being that has this property, right? So now we have a definition. Can we, from this definition, make an inference about evidence, right? So like I said before, if your definition is, you can only make an inference about evidence if your definition is well defined enough. Is this definition well defined enough to make a claim about evidence? I would say no, right? So it is not. We cannot really make a claim about evidence with this definition alone because it isn't well defined. I remember, so I was debating this one guy on Reddit, right? So he was saying so I was basically, like I said, I was asking him a whole bunch of questions, and he of course, I asked him what evidence of God looks like. I don't even think I mentioned it yet. So when I'm debating atheists, I always ask them this basic question. I always say, they always say that there's no evidence of God, and I always ask them, what does evidence of God look like, right? Just tell me what evidence of God looks like, and I'll I'll try to look for it and present it to you, right? So what is this thing such that when you see it, you conclude, yes, God exists. And because you haven't seen this thing yet, you've observed reality and you haven't seen this thing, you're now saying there's no evidence of God, or you're concluding there's no God. What is this magical thing that you need to see to help you to realize that, right? Because you can't make a claim there's no evidence of God without at least having some type of thing to compare it to say that what you saw didn't match this thing, therefore I can't consider this evidence of God, right? You need to do, my claim is you need to do that in order to say there's no evidence of God. And I always ask them that. And to this day, nobody has given me a straight answer on that, right? I've never gotten a straight answer. They always prevaricate and go into all this other stuff and obfuscate and this and that, right? They never give me a direct answer because they eventually start to recognize that they're making this mistake, right? This logical fallacy. So I asked this one guy, I start off every debate the same exact way, and I just always ask them for evidence of God. I always asked them what evidence of God looks like. So I asked this guy, and of course he went to a religion thing and started telling me, he was like, oh, well, most people consider this to be properties of God, and most religions say this about God, and this and that. I mean, mostly he was just going to Christianity, and I was like, oh, well, it's possible for God to exist without those things being true. Is your claim that if God exists, he has to have these properties that are ascribed to him from other religions? And then he was like, well, no. And I was like, exactly, right? So what is a proper definition of God such that, well, I was asking him, what is evidence of God? If you agree that God can exist without these properties being ascribed to him, then with the evidence of God that you're saying isn't existing based on those things, you don't need to see it to make a conclusion about God's existence. So tell me what this new evidence is. If we accept that God doesn't have to exist based on these properties, then again, tell me what evidence looks like. So what he did, he realized where I was going with it. And so he said, is if we accept this idea that God exists, or he only has if we define him only as a being with the property that he created the universe, and we presume that he exists because we're here, right? The universe exists. Then he said it's a meaningless statement because you can't know any other information about God, therefore it's pointless. And I was like, no, right? That's not true at all. Why? Right? And so this is what atheists always do. They always add some random non sequitur or a complete fallacy, something that logically does not follow from initial premise. They do this all the time with God. So I was asking him, I'm like, why? Why would it be the case that if God exists with the property that he created the universe, why is it now impossible to know anything about him? Right? I didn't say that was the only property that God has to exist. I just defined him as a being with the property that, I defined him as any being with the property that he created the universe. Right? Now, in the process of creating the universe, there could ultimately be many other properties that he has, right? So there may be other properties we can learn about him, but we have to actually have a means of learning that information about him, right? And what the atheist is doing, and fundamentally just comes from laziness, like I said, right? A lot of their ideas are just born out of laziness, right? What he doesn't like is that it's difficult. This is not a strong enough definition, right? It's not a well-defined definition. So it is hard to know more about God based on this property alone. Yes, that's the point of life, right? Now you got to work. You actually got to do something to figure out how to know God or more about him with this property. Discover the other properties that he has that must necessarily be included with this property, right? Just because I don't know what they are doesn't mean they don't exist, right? I have to actually work to figure out what those are, right? And so I can define many things with some initial property, and there are other properties that come along for the ride that I may not be aware of. So for example, and actually, no, I'll tie this into the other thing I was going to say, right? No, I was going to get into that with this case with empirical evidence fallacy. No, excuse me. I'll say it now, then I'll just read that off. So let's say that I'm looking at the wall, right? So the wall consists of matter, right? Very simple. Now, if the wall has the property that it consists of matter, guess what other properties it has? It has the property that it exhibits wave-particle duality, right? So wave-particle duality is a quantum mechanical phenomenon where a particle has properties both of a wave and of a particle. Now, if you're not familiar with science, basically a wave is just something that propagates through space or a field of some kind. The particle is considered to be a dimensionless, simple point, right? Now, generally, when you describe behavior that consists of particles, it is very opposite to behavior, or it has behavior that really can't really be demonstrated by a wave propagating through space. So they're very opposite phenomena, right? And in the macroscopic world, right, so the world that we can see with our eyes, or, if something is very big, but far away, but as long as it's very big, it doesn't really demonstrate wave-particle duality, right? They're clearly separate phenomena. But at the quantum level, they're like the same thing, right? We don't know how that works. It's hard to imagine it, but it's just the way it is, right? And if you do experiments with a particle at a quantum level, depending on the experiment, sometimes it'll look more like a wave, sometimes it'll look more like a particle. Just depends on which experiment you're performing. But we can recognize based on these experiments that it really has both properties, right, at the same time somehow, right? But here's the thing. If I'm looking at a wall, I'm asserting the property that the wall consists of matter. But what also exists in addition to that property is the property that it exhibits wave-particle duality. Now, do I recognize that based on the initial property that the wall consists of matter, which I accept? No, I don't recognize that. What do I have to do? I have to actually do work, right? I have to work to learn more about the wall based on this property that it consists of matter, right? To figure out what its other properties are, right? And there was a Greek, I don't know if he was a Greek philosopher. I probably was, or a scientist. Well, they weren't really scientists. You know what I'm saying, right? A thinker back then. I think, was it Democritus? I think I remember hearing that, Democritus or Democritus. He was some Greek person who came up with the idea of the atom. I could be totally wrong, but that's what I think. Right? He came up with the idea of the atom way before the more scientific understanding of the atom. But he had this idea that there's probably some indivisible component of matter, which like I said, you can't divide it more, that makes up matter, which is pretty cool, right? Because that's true. But he had that idea way back when, right? But let's say we accepted that idea that that's true. Does that mean that there's nothing more we can learn about matter now because we accepted that property? Of course not, right? You didn't have the additional information based on that initial premise, but you got more of it. There were more things that necessarily had to be true just because of that initial truth. You didn't recognize that at first, but you learned it, right? You learned it later by actually working, by actually engaging in science, right? That's what you can do with God, right? You accept the initial premise that God is any being with the property that they created the universe, and you recognize that there may be other properties that come along for the ride. There may not be, but in order to learn if that's true, you actually have to work and not be lazy and just say, oh, well, I can't know everything based on this simple property, therefore God can't have any of them and there's nothing I can know. No, you could know if you weren't lazy, right? So basically, I just say that was basically that debate with that atheist. But I'm just saying that if you start with the initial premise that God is any being with the property that they created the universe, it is not a well-defined enough definition to make any claim about evidence, right? And this is the problem I was talking about earlier. Well, how then do you gain information about God starting with this sort of initial premise? Exactly. That's the problem, right? And I'm going to address that problem how you would in the next couple of videos, and mainly in the last video. But to go to this next point, which I kind of already said it basically brings home what empirical evidence fallacy is. So to go over it here, empirical evidence fallacy is the mistake of making a claim about empirical evidence for a thing without it being well defined enough to do so. In other words, like I just said, it's when you say that something doesn't exist based on, now when I say empirical evidence, I mean of the physical reality specifically. So when you say that there is no evidence, when you say there is evidence for a thing or there isn't evidence for something that you say has a particular property, or even if you say it exists, if you say there's no evidence that you can observe in the physical reality supporting that claim, you are not justified in doing that if this thing isn't well defined enough. And that's what atheists always do, right? And so that's empirical evidence fallacy. So when you say that, when they say there's no evidence of this or there's no evidence of God, and if you present this to them, if you present intelligent design or teleological argument and say the universe is so complex and it's so well designed and this and that, that's evidence of God. They'll say, well, no, that's not necessarily evidence of God, or they're not convinced by that. I presume they believe that the universe could have existed somehow without God, right? I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But they'll say that, and so they'll say, oh, we don't know enough about the beginning of the universe, things like that, which that part's actually true. But here is the problem with this, right? Here's the problem, and this is really important. What the atheist is fundamentally getting at is partially true, but it's also partially incorrect in how they're interpreting it, and that partial incorrectness is the main fallacy which a huge amount of atheist logic and atheist beliefs are based on. So what they'll say is basically that the things they see in reality are not evidence of God, right? But actually, no, to explain that, let me get to this next point, which I kind of said before, but I'll just read this. It says, atheists often fail to realize that saying something isn't evidence of God is a positive claim that must be defended. So that's what I was saying before. So, excuse me, if I say that the God exists based on the complexity of the universe, right, and the atheist says that's not evidence of God, then that's a positive claim. That means presumably it's possible to have a complex universe without God existing. But then how do you know that? How could you make that claim, right? The only way you can really make a claim like that, and that goes back to what I was saying before about inferences, right? If a definition is well defined enough, you can make an inference about what evidence looks like, even if you don't necessarily have the means to prove that it doesn't exist, right? You can make an inference about what it looks like to make a conclusion that probably it exists or probably it doesn't exist. But in order to make that inference, your definition has to be well defined enough. If you don't have a well defined enough definition, you can't really make an inference about whether something probably exists or probably doesn't exist. You can't do it one way or the other. You don't know enough, right? And so in order to make an inference about whether or not intelligent design is probably evidence of God or probably isn't, you need to know what's involved in creating universes, right? So very simple. If you created a universe, then you know what's involved, and you can say, okay, I created a whole bunch of universes, I understand everything about creating a universe, and I know that if a universe is created, then there should be these particular things in reality that I see. Because I'm not seeing these things, then I conclude that there is no being with the property that they created the universe. But you can only make that inference if you know enough about creating universes, which we do not, right? So we don't know what's involved in creating a universe. We have no idea what happened before the Big Bang or how everything got there. Atheists will usually use that same claim for God. How did who created God and how did he get there? Which I'll address that claim too, because that's also a nonsense argument. But I'll address that in a moment, either in this video or the next video. Because the next video we're going to talk about supernatural things, right? So, but what they'll say is, if you make the claim that the intelligent design or teleological or the complexity of the universe is not evidence of God, then on some level you're saying that the universe could exist without, it can have complexity without God existing, without a being with this property. Then explain to me how. Just explain to me what's involved in creating a universe, and then I will say, yes, you have a justified claim for why the complexity of the universe is not evidence of God. Of course they don't, because they have no idea what's involved in creating a universe. And so what makes this important is that when it comes down to it, right, if we use this bare bones definition of God, we don't know what's involved in creating a universe. If we use this bare bones definition of God, we don't know what evidence of God is. We don't know what evidence of God is from what it isn't, right? In other words, going back to the concept of matter, right? If I'm looking at the wall, right? Let's say I exist way back in ancient Greece, but I come up with the idea of atoms and matter, right? I can look at a wall and I'm seeing evidence of atoms. I'm seeing evidence of protons. I'm seeing evidence of quantum phenomena, quantum behavior, superposition, wave particle duality, uncertainty principle, things like that. I'm seeing all of that stuff I'm looking at something that contains that evidence, but I don't realize it. Now, because I don't realize it, could I then make the claim that the wall is not evidence of quantum phenomena that some random person is talking about? Of course I can't. I could say it, but I would be wrong, right? And what was my mistake? Empirical evidence fallacy, right? So the wall I didn't know enough about the wall or the matter the wall is made up of it wasn't well defined enough to make a claim that quantum phenomena don't exist, right? And so basically, so I was engaging in empirical evidence fallacy. And my argument is that's what atheists do. When they look at the world around them and they say there's no evidence of God, you don't know enough about creating a universe to say what's evidence and what isn't evidence. For all you know, everything could be evidence of God. It could be impossible for anything to be here without a being with this property existing. You don't know that. Just because you don't recognize that fact doesn't mean it isn't true. Just like if I don't recognize matter is made up of quantum particles that exhibit quantum behavior, just because I don't recognize it doesn't mean it's true. None of this could be here if quantum particles weren't doing what they're doing, right? So the issue is not really a question of evidence, right? And so that's very important. It's a question of discernment, right? And so that it's a subtle difference, but it's very important, right? Because now we realize what the problem is. And this is, like I said, this is the problem I was talking about in the beginning of the video. There is a problem when it comes to knowing who God is, and that problem is not a problem of evidence. It's a problem of discernment. What atheists think is because they can't discern what evidence of God is, that must mean evidence doesn't exist. Of course that's not true. That's nonsense, right? Because I can't discern what the nature of matter is such that I can make conclusions about quantum phenomena, that doesn't mean they don't exist or that the wall isn't demonstrating them, right? I need a way of gaining that discernment of the evidence of those things, which is what science does, right? So in science, when they come up with a theory about something, they don't say that evidence of this thing does or doesn't exist. They perform an experiment that allows them to get discernment, to get more information about this thing. And then when they have more information, then they can say, yeah, this doesn't exist based on the level of discernment that I have. And by the way, in science, it happens all the time, right? You can have something like classical mechanics. So you can have something like classical mechanics. So classical mechanics is basically the very initial early stages of physics, and it describes the macroscopic world according to physical laws. Basically, it's the most modern framework it's the earliest framework of modern physics, I should say. So it was invented by Isaac Newton, Leibniz, I think he helped with calculus, things like that. But so in classical mechanics, basically classical physics, it describes the nature of reality. Now, what we learned is that those rules aren't actually true, right? When you go to really, 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 really small levels, or if you go to if you move really, really, really fast, right? Which is quantum mechanics and special relativity, right? So if you move really fast or get really small, those laws break down. It's not really that they break down. It's just that you need the more precise laws of the universe to explain what you're seeing. You can ignore that precision when you get further away from those extreme conditions. And so basically that's kind of what we can say about God, right? So in other words, in that instance, you had to gain a larger degree of discernment to make claims about evidence for the truth of, or I should say, classical mechanics appeared to be true until you had a larger degree of discernment, right? Then you realized it was false and you got greater truth, right? But for that time, it seemed like you had truth, right? But you didn't realize. So discernment is very important. It is perfectly possible that for the atheist, for something to not seem like it's evidence of God, but it actually is, right? And so fundamentally, to say it again, right, to bring it all home, which is pretty much the whole point of this video, is when we're talking about evidence of God, we're not talking about whether there's something we can look at and then make a determination if God exists or not, right? At least not in a physical reality. Because in order to look at something in physical reality, we would need to know what's involved in creating a universe, right? And I argue no person has that information. So if we don't know that, then we can't make any claim. We can't even make a claim that God exists based on things we see. So we can't make a claim that God exists or he doesn't exist based on evidence. So how can we possibly know anything about God then if we can't use anything we're seeing? Well, we now have to find out a way to gain more information about a being with this property, but now our goal is mainly discernment. Very important. It's discernment of evidence, not sort of looking at evidence, random evidence we see, and then concluding if it can or can't exist, or if a being with this property can or can't exist based on what we're observing. That's nonsense, right? So that's very important. So that's empirical evidence fallacy. That's what atheists engage in all the time. This is one of the core fallacies that almost their entire belief system is based on, right? And when I'm debating atheists, right, so when I debated them online, what they always try to do, and I see them successfully do it all the time, when they're debating other people who believe in God, they always try to position the debate and the argument into the person who believes in God, sort of saying why this thing is evidence of God or this thing proves God exists. You can't do that. Because you can just, whatever definition you can set up is going to have, if there's anything you can observe in a physical reality such that you can make a conclusion that God exists as you've defined him based on this thing, then your definition is going to include extraneous properties that are unjustified, right? If you keep reducing the definition of God eventually to something that's more justified like this, eventually it's going to become not well defined enough to be able to make any conclusions about evidence, period. That's what's always going to happen. Like I said, I've debated so many atheists, and I just position debate into that sort of condition, epistemological condition over and over and over and over again. I've done it so many times, it's just like got old. I don't care to do it anymore, right? But I will see atheists successfully do it with others, because a lot of other people who talk about the existence of God, they don't really understand that. So the atheists will continuously try to sort of almost pressure them and try to get the argument into a position where they have to defend why something proves God. If that's the case, then they can never win, because you can always just sort of truncate the definition of God or show why some definition they're working from is not sufficient or it's not justified, and you can always truncate the definitions to make anything evidence they're trying to give not be justified based on that definition. You can always do that. So you can never present evidence of God in that manner. It's impossible, right? And so that's why they love being in that position. They love trying to get a person who believes in God to say that you have to demonstrate why this thing you're presenting to me is evidence of God. It's impossible to do that, right? At least it's impossible relative to this epistemological standard, right? The idea that this thing proves that some God exists based on whatever random definition you're making up. And I always see people fall for it. I'm like, no. When I've debated them and they try to do that with me, I immediately reverse it, right? So as soon as they say there's no evidence of God and they start going, because they know I'm Christian, right? They start going into the Bible and this and that. I'm like, okay, let's start from the beginning premise. Let's say the Bible is incorrect, which it's not, but let's say it's incorrect. Right? I just go straight to this definition and say, you present evidence of God to me. Because now I'm demonstrating that they made a positive claim when they said there's no evidence of God. Now, if the atheist says, I don't know what evidence of God is, maybe this is evidence of God, maybe the world around me is evidence of God, maybe it's not, I don't know, right? Then that would be accurate. No problem, right? Because I actually agree with that, right? But a lot of atheists don't do that. They say, no, this marker right here, for example, they say this is not evidence of God exists. This doesn't prove God exists. Why? That's not the same thing as saying that this may prove God exists. I don't know. I'm not able to discern it well enough. If they said that, that would be correct. But if they say that this doesn't prove God's existence, that's a positive claim. That's a positive claim on what evidence is. In that case, then you tell me what evidence looks like. What is the property this marker is missing such that it doesn't allow you to conclude God's existence? You must have something to compare it to. So as soon as you say that, now they're on the defensive, and then I just start going into this, and I just eventually get their definition to move lower and lower and lower and lower until they recognize that that the definition is not well defined and there's no claim they can make about evidence based on that. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention, which was this point, which has to do with sufficiency fallacy. So what atheists will often do is they'll have some random definition of God, and then they'll make up what a sufficient condition for evidence is. So for example, I was talking to this one girl who said, well, if God, because I asked her, what does evidence of God look like? Just tell me. That's all I want to know. So I want just at least one atheist to just tell me what evidence of God looks like. And so then she said, well, if God, if someone's limb got chopped off and God healed it and you grew back, then I'll believe in God. So I asked her, like, okay, no problem. Let me ask you a question. Is it possible for God to exist without doing that? Or can he only exist if he has the property that he healed some limb for you? She started getting upset, like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm like, okay, no problem, right? So let me ask you a question. Let me ask you another question. What is, in presenting evidence of God, in me presenting evidence of God to you, you tell me what evidence of God looks like, right? Because we established that it doesn't have to be healing. It's perfectly possible for God to exist without healing some limb. So what is this thing that you need to see, since it's not that would convince you God exists? And I just keep playing this game over and over and over again. In other words, what she did was she asked for a sufficient condition for God's existence. No problem. I'm sure many people have sufficient conditions for God's existence, right? If God threw a lightning bolt across the sky for them, right? Or if he gave them some supernatural experience, or if he, shook the planet or took the universe apart and put it back together, you might be willing to believe he exists. But that's a sufficient condition. You can't conclude he doesn't exist based on a sufficient condition. You can only conclude that there's no evidence for him that you have observed based on a necessary condition. And based on this definition, what is the necessary condition for God exists? What's this necessary condition that evidence has to have for you to conclude that God doesn't exist? We don't know, right? You have to know more about creating universes to know what the necessary condition for this to be true is, and we don't know that. So, like I said, I know I beat a dead horse a little bit, but I just basically want to make it clear. That's what empirical evidence fallacy is. There's nothing I could present to you in the physical world that says this is evidence for or against God. It's impossible. What we have to do is look for some new way to gain information about God and what his other properties might be, such that we can gain discernment and know that he exists. And that's, like I said, is the problem involved in understanding God. And I'm going to answer that throughout the chapters, but mainly in the last chapter. And fundamentally, it's just the same thing you would do in science, right? You have a hypothesis that something exists based on some observation, and then you keep sort of running tests on it and experiments, and eventually you collect data and you start to understand its other properties. Very simple. It's no different. The process is no different from what you would do in science. Atheists never really do that because laziness, right? They don't want to. They like feeling like they have all the answers and they don't have to do any work to know anything else, right? Because if they admit they don't have to do answers, God forbid, they'll have to actually work, right, to gain more answers. I shouldn't say that, but I'm just saying, that's how some atheists I've talked to are, right? I know all atheists aren't like that, and I'm definitely not talking about soft atheists who say, I just don't know. I'm talking about the ones who've done all the research and have concluded there is no God, because I've talked to those ones too. Right? So the last thing I want to talk about, this is something that's going to come up in a lot of our discussion, so I figured I'll just say it early, right? It's something that I call stars and stripes fallacy. So I'll read it off, and then I'll kind of say where I get this from. So just to read it, it says, stars and stripes fallacy is the fallacy of placing a condition on reality and presuming that reality must operate according to this imagined condition, right? So so many of atheist arguments employ this fallacy. It happens so often I just made up a new fallacy for it. I made up a new word for it. Maybe there is some fallacy in logic theory that, talks about this. I don't know. But I just made it up because it's like they do this all the time, right? So what am I actually saying with that? Well, first I'll just say that I was watching My Hero Academia, right? So My Hero Academia is actually an anime, which is really good, so I like it. It's about heroes, and it's basically about a bunch of heroes. I think I already recorded the video, so I think I mentioned it later. So when you get across it, just, let me just say it again, right? But, so My Hero Academia is an anime about a whole bunch of heroes, and one of the heroes has this power. Her name is called Stars and Stripes, right? So she has this power where I think if she has to touch something first or say his name, it's something like that, right? But she has the power to place conditions on actual reality, right? So she could place conditions, like if she wants herself to be stronger, she just places conditions on herself and she's stronger, right? So I think it's called like a reality bending perk or something like that. Their powers are basically associated with something called a quirk. I don't want to get into what that is, but yeah, so basically you can look it up, right? So her name is Stars and Stripes. She has the power to bend reality or place conditions on reality in a certain way. Now that's obviously just a cartoon, right? It isn't real. We don't have the ability to place conditions on this reality. But atheists do it all the time, right? It's like I just started calling it Stars and Stripes fallacy. You're actually going to see me kind of refer to it a little bit. I don't have the name yet. But in the later videos that I recorded, you'll see me say things where I'm kind of getting to it, but I hadn't made the term yet, right? Because it comes up so often that eventually I just made the term, right? So in other words, what I mean by that is atheists will always make some claim, right? And inherent in that claim is some random condition they placed on reality, right? And they will make claims about God based on some random condition they just made up, right? It's perfectly possible that reality doesn't have this condition you just imagined in your head, right? So if that's the case, you can't make conclusions about what you see in reality, which is almost empirical evidence fallacy, but it's a little bit stronger. And we're going to see that be the case in the other videos. But it's perfectly possible that reality doesn't have these random conditions you just made up in your head. So you can't necessarily draw conclusions with these conditions you just presume to be true, right? They do it with everything. Right, and that's you kind of already seen it with this. So when you talk to an atheist about evidence, when they say there's no evidence of God, right, and they start going to all these things about religion, and they would see this in the world and this and that if the God and religion was true, that's Stars and Stripes fallacy, right? You place some condition on reality that said that God can't exist unless he's one of the religions that you read about. Why? He could exist without being any one of those. You place some random condition on reality and then made presumptions based on the condition you just made up in your head, right? And almost all of their beliefs imply that to some degree. But that's why I just wanted to say it here, that I just started calling it Stars and Stripes fallacy off the character Stars and Stripes, right? Because a lot of times atheists will almost think they have this power, the same power as a cartoon character, right? So, like I said, I'm going to refer to this in a later video, so I just wanted to get it out the way in this video. But yeah, so this video is really long already. I know I beat a dead horse like crazy, right? But I just wanted to really establish it. So that's empirical evidence fallacy. In the next video, we're going to now talk about supernatural phenomena. Because what atheists will always say, and this is also at the core of atheist beliefs generally, is there's no such thing as supernatural phenomena. It's very rare. I know they do exist, but it's very rare to have, it's very rare to have an atheist who doesn't believe in the supernatural. So that's why I want to address it. Right? They say there's no such thing as a supernatural phenomenon. It's never been proven. That's also wrong. Doesn't make any sense. It's not true, right? That's just them engaging in this Stars and Stripes fallacy, placing random conditions on reality, right? So we're going to address that in the next video, though. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.